Hello and welcome to the King Player podcast. Let's talk about women's cricket, women's test cricket to be precise. And in the last year and a half, we have had four women's tests, one of them being a day-night one. And there's been a lot of action in those four tests. There's been turns, there's been five-wicket hauls, and there's been some really good cricket played all around. So let's get deep into it. So, Stuff, how are you? And please take it away.
Hey, yeah, I'm doing quite good. So, there have been four women's tests since COVID began, which is it's remarkably reasonable progress on the amount of test cricket per the frequency of women's test cricket per year. Because two tests per year for 2 years. It's quite good, and it's also quite sad that that is groundbreaking numbers. But we're gonna take it back to the beginning. June 2021. India played England in a test match. India's first test match in quite a while.
One of the biggest thing coming out of that game was probably the rain because until it intervened, I think it looked like one of those tests that would actually yield a result. But ultimately, even though there was a chance of getting result, irrespective of the rain, we I think we got a reasonably good game out of it. I mean, yes, that was more or less a 3 innings, yet we got to see a lot of things. I mean, we saw batting balls, there was some collapses here and there, and yet when the game ended, I think a lot of people were satisfied that they got to see such a great game of test cricket.
Yeah, so it begins with England making a reasonable score of 396, and then India's first innings starts out quite well, but then it all falls apart, which forces India to follow on. And then India's follow-on score again has its good moments, has its bad moments, but in the end they hang on. And yeah, it was a difficult match for India, but they hang on. They saved the test. There were quite a bit of complaints about both the rain and also the match ended a little early because of bad lights. Yeah, it wasn't the worst game to end a very long hiatus from Test cricket. And one discussion point that actually came up after the match was that not only was this India's first Test match in a long time, it was the first class match most of India's players had ever played. And even for England, it was most of their players don't get to play very much first class cricket. So that was another discussion point about how good can you be at playing like this if you don't get to play this format very often.
There's a bigger like a bigger onus of the whole thing is on the cricket boards themselves because ultimately the players can only get as good as the opportunities that they get, and especially with boards like India and England who are rather well off and can afford to invest a lot more than they do right now in the women's FC setup because what we saw in in this game and across all the three innings was that there was a lot of good performances. I think what there were eight scores of 50 plus in the game itself. Some were by the same people. I think Shefali Verma got 50 plus in both the innings. So obviously there's a lot of talent available. Some of them are relatively new, some of them are actually pretty seasoned. But ultimately, I think it boils down to the people who are supposed to be organizing this because if players cannot play the game, then how are they supposed to improve themselves? Even though we've seen, despite the lack of practice, some of the people did really well.
India's both of India's openers, Sneh Rana and Shafali Verma, did quite well in that game. Verma, who was 16 at the time, no, 17 at the time. She had
17,
just yeah, she
17.
had just turned 17 a little bit ago. She goes on and makes 96 on debut, and then gets out right after.
And the biggest surprising point of the game was probably how bad some of the rather senior players did in it because Mithali Raj or even I think Nat Siver from England side did not do much on the batting front. And even I think Smriti Mandana got 50 in the first innings, but she also got out quite early in the second innings. And I think this was a proper youngsters game because Sophie Eccleston got 8 wickets in the game, with four in the first innings, four in the second innings. Sneerana, who was also a debutant, she also got four, then went on to score that 80. And it just shows how good these people are at playing the game that is probably rooted to the basics, isn't it?
Like one interesting thing I've heard from players and people within cricket is that uh, like you have other formats and they have their strengths and weaknesses, but the best way to develop proper cricket skills is to play first class cricket. That's the reason the Intercontinental Cup existed. That was the whole impetus behind that, to get developing nations to play first class cricket, because that's the only way you can get better at specific skills, which only come up in this sort of long form cricket. Yeah, a lot of the women's cricketers don't get to play any first class cricket at all. Like even England and Australia, they have very limited domestic first class seasons. So outside of the test matches, they don't get to play much. India again don't play any at all.
And this is the problem, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, there's players who have done really well in the limited opportunities that they've gotten. But if you just keep spinning the wheel once a year, then I don't think you know there's going to be you know enthusiasm on either side of the sport, because obviously you want people to support their team and you want players to get better with passing time. Both things need to happen parallelly, but again, as I said, it boils down to the people who are supposed to be organizing this, and if they don't, then I don't see that development happening.
So moving on to the next game, we jump to September to 2021. So India makes a trip to Australia, and on that trip, they also play a test match, a historic test match. This is the first test match, women's test, to not feature England since I think the early 2000s. And
Actually, there was India versus South Africa game in 2014.
so the first one to not feature England since in 7 years, which is quite a long
Yep.
time.
Yep.
So we have India on a trip to Australia. Once again, the second first class match for most players in the Indian team, and Australia's first game against someone that's not England in quite a while. And yeah, take it away from there. How does the game go?
I think this game was probably, you know, ultimately going to highlight what one of the rare weakness of the Australian women's team is, because in the shorter formats, both T20 and ODI, their I think biggest strength is how they control the game. But it was one of those games where they did not have a lot of control over the proceedings, whether it be when they were bowling or when they were batting. And it showed, because I think outside of maybe Perry's innings or his innings, there was not a lot of positives for Australia coming out of the game, because India scored a big total, put Australia in, got them 240 for 9. I think they declared, so that the game could be a little more interesting. But even in the limited amount of time that the second innings got, I think India were rather comfortable, and it has been that way with India's women's team in the red ball setup, because they have beaten England in England. They have beaten South Africa in India, and obviously we have just talked about the drawn test. And then there was this test where they were in control for know a big chunk of time. So that shows how good India is at red ball cricket, because that is you know you can simply attribute it to the fact that they are good at probably following the basics. That if you see someone like Mithali Raj or even Poonam Raut, this is what the batting is. I mean, they follow the basics as closely as possible, and test match is probably the format where they get the biggest amount of results in it. And as we saw, India dominated the test, and Australia, while they had some shining spots here and there, ultimately, were pretty behind in the test match and even could have lost it if
Now, this match was played at Carrara Oval, which is not one of the traditional grounds in Australia. This is one of the outgrounds in Queensland. And this brings up another interesting point about women's test cricket, and that most of these games are played at smaller grounds, played at the non-traditional grounds in most of these countries. Now, in England, India's test in England was played at Bristol, which, while not being one of the traditional, big centers of cricket, is still a reasonably sized international ground that gets a lot of men's games as well and hosts a lot of important domestic matches. Whereas Carrara Oval is a much more low-profile ground. Uh, and the following year, as we'll get to later, uh, they play a women's test in Canberra, which is closer to a traditional ground than Carrara. And previously, they've even played games at Sydney, at the North Sydney Oval, which again is a non-traditional ground. And a lot of England's home tests have been played at Wormsley, which barely even hosts any domestic men's matches. So it brings up another interesting point about women's cricket in that you tend to not get the best grounds to play these matches in. And in addition to another issue that came up during this test match, the length of the match, they tend to not combine very well.
the biggest issue is obviously, as we have, I mean, I brought it up a little, but the rain. I mean, obviously, you already have just 4 days to, go through the proceedings. I think it's 100 overs per day, but ultimately, the rain and combined with the fact that you have 50 overs less than men's game, which obviously there's a good chance that would be even less because a lot of times you won't get through 100 overs on the day, even if there's no rain disruptions, because obviously 100 overs is a big feat to achieve in a whole day, unless you have a lot of spinners bowling the overs. And that has been an issue because, as I said, uh, I think there was a good chance that three out of these four games could have had an actual result had it not been for the rain, and combined with the fact that they were, you know, they did not have a lot of time, since obviously there's 4 days, and when several sessions are washed out due to the rain, then it has to be a draw because there's no other way around it. It is not an ODI or a T20 where you can shorten the game. It just gets down to the point where matches will be washed out, and it is not a good thing, or not even a good advertisement for the game itself, because results are what have made a test match a little more enjoyable these days. I mean, earlier the the players used to be much more famous in general, or test matches would have a bigger crowd, but there used to be a lot of draws. But recently, I think we have seen how, particularly in men's cricket, how the number of draws has gone down drastically, and that is something that has made the game much more interesting in general. And I think this is same is the way to go with the women's cricket as well, especially as you said, some of them are not even played on the first choice wickets. Even the India versus South Africa game was played in Mysore. It is in in the southern India, in Karnataka, and it is also not a first choice stadium. So yep, that is something that needs to be changed, because obviously when these games would be played on, rather, you know uh, these first choice wickets, maybe MCG, SCG, even Canberra. Yep, Canberra was at least better than playing it at Carrara. And I think I would like to bring up another point regarding the same. So, do you think the game should be extended to 5 days, or would you rather have just the number of overs, being tackled better, and maybe games being organized with respect to weather?
I would say give the option for either 4 days or 5 days, and even give an option for 3 days if it encourages more people to play Test cricket, because it's better to play it than not play it at all. Even they think it's better to play a shorter game than to not play Test cricket at all. So I think if you just give teams the options to agree on how long the match should be before, and not force them into 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, then I think that'll be the best case. Like yeah, you can manage overs better. You can be stricter on over rates to make sure they're bowling. I think the goal is 100 or 110 overs a day for 4 day matches. And yeah, like it's because like some of these matches they definitely could have made them 5 days. Like the women's Ashes test that we'll get to in a little bit, or even England India women's test match. You could probably make those 5 days, and they would get, and they would like the boards would agree to it because financially it would work out. Women's Ashes test and an England India test. But for other test matches like South Africa India, they probably struggle to do a 5 day match if it could only be 5 days. They'd probably struggle to get it played because it would be very expensive. So if 4 day test being an option makes the test happen at all, then I think that's better than not playing any test cricket at all. If a 3 day test match would encourage more teams to play test cricket, then you should let them play 3 days. Yeah, again, I just think that playing test cricket at all is better than uh, trying to chase some perfect form of test cricket.
Is that financial viability is kind of an issue with the overall existence of red ball cricket itself, which is why there's much lesser sides even in the men's cricket playing test cricket. And as I said, there's Intercontinental Cup, that particularly existed for the betterment of red ball cricket. And uh, even coming to the women's game, I think it is kind of what men's cricket was in early 2000s, where there were a lot more spinners in the game and pacers were kind of limited to bowling the early overs. And there were a lot of good pacers, but ultimately it were the spinners that would be the you know main stars of the show, to say the least. And I think same is the case here as well. I think we have seen Sneh Rana or Sophie Eggleston or even Rajeshwari Gaikwad do really well. And so, do you think that would be something that would be a big factor in as it was in these games? And could it be a big factor in the development of women's cricket, women's red ball cricket, because there's a lot of really good spinners, which means if they are given that kind of pitches, then we could really have some tests that could be getting good results.
Yeah, that's another thing that comes up quite a bit is that so the pitches end up not being very good because again most of these games aren't played at traditional venues, and so the pitches are more tired. The pitches haven't been maintained as well, and then you end up getting lower quality matches. Yeah, like if you encourage more women's test cricket, more women's first class cricket, they'd be more likely to play, on better tracks and get better at the game and uh, make it a more exciting thing to watch.